Mr. Moderator, I'd like to ask for an additional 3 minutes.
No, you're jumping the gun here.
Okay,
First, you have to
right.
make a motion.
All right.
I know it's exciting.
That might not be the word I'd use, but all right. I move the town appropriate $30,000 from free cash to be utilized by the Amherst Charter Commission for the purpose of engaging consultant services related to its operation.
Motion's been made and seconded, and now you may speak to your motion.
I'd like to request an additional 3 minutes for me and my colleague Gerry Weiss to jointly present.
A total of 8 minutes has been requested. The speaking time will be divided between Mr. Churchill and Mr. Weiss. Without objections, you may proceed.
And there's a PowerPoint that... So good evening. In our presentation this evening, we'll briefly introduce the commission and its work, how this article came about, what a consultant could help with, and then Gerry will follow me by discussing the process by which the full commission tested this proposal before bringing it to you. I would just like to say we have a really good group on the commission. I'm really happy with the group that the voters have sent to us. We have a range of perspectives that reflects, I think, the perspectives of Amherst. There's a tone of respect and collaboration among all of us, and you'll note that 7 of the 9 members of the commission are town meeting members. We've started by researching what our job is, how other charter commissions have done their work around the state, how previous Amherst commissions have worked, what the appropriate role and scope of consultants versus committee members is, and we held our first public hearing on May 12th, which is basically a down payment on many other outreach processes that we'll be conducting going forward. Next slide, please. So the work. Just briefly, when we're talking about a charter, we're talking about the foundational document of a city or town government, basically the constitution of a municipality. We also, as you know, have many bylaws or ordinances which are subordinate to the charter. Next slide. So we're taking a comprehensive look at the various components that go into a charter. So those considerations include what should the legislative branch look like? What should the executive branch look like? What about other elected officials? How about administrative organization, including departments, boards, and committees? What are the financial policies and procedures, for example, the budget process? What about citizen relief mechanisms such as petitions or recall votes? And then if such a thing were to be approved, what would the transition provisions look like? So it's a broad look at what improvements could be made to our current process. Next slide. So this is our to-do list that we basically agreed upon and how we're going to proceed. We're proceeding from that our task is to gather input on the values of the community as regards to how it governs itself. So what do we really like? What do we really value about how our government works, and what would we like to see? From these values, we'll look to identify design criteria that we can use in assessing the various components of a charter, and research options and identify models from around the state and possibly elsewhere. Some have suggested other university college communities to look at. And ultimately, we would match those design criteria based on community values with the various components of a proposed charter. So the deadline is we have to have a draft document by July 31st of 2017 that we then get feedback from the community and from the Attorney General and others. We produce the final charter document by September 29th of 2017, and then we communicate to the community to tell them what it's about, and it's up to the community at that point to decide if they like it or not. So how did this article come about? Before the commission was elected, I was talking to a member of the East Longmeadow Charter Commission, and he was talking about the importance of expert support in doing a process this complex and important. Next slide, please. So basically, he talked about a number of ways that a consultant had helped them. They were able to offer best practices on how to collect input from the entire community. They were able to do the legwork on researching comparable municipalities to identify ones that might have some things in common with them. They were able to identify government elements from a database of other charters that they had. So if they said we want something that really emphasizes citizen involvement, they could pull together a bunch of provisions from their database to say, well, here are some ways of doing that. They can provide legal language that would pass muster with the Attorney General, and they could give protocols and timelines to make sure that the work goes forward in a timely manner. So this seemed important, but we had a timeline problem. To get a consultant, we needed funding, and to get funding, we needed to go to town meeting, but the town meeting article deadline was before the election of the commission, so the commission couldn't ask. So I put together a petition article in case the commission passed, which I would withdraw if it were defeated, to enable this support if it were approved. Next slide, please. There are other necessary costs, and the town is required to provide $5,000 to support this work. But all of the consultant costs, can I have the previous slide, please? Those are the kinds of things that we don't have the funds for at this point. So you have with you, hopefully that you picked up this sheet from the table. Could I have the overhead, please? Right. Oops. There. I'll give my annotated one. So this is the process we went through. March 31st, we went to the Finance Committee. April 4th, we went to the Select Board. Both of them requested that the Charter Commission meet and discuss and let them know if they supported this. So on April 11th, the full Charter Commission met, and by a 9-0 vote, the Commission approved the following motion, which I read previously. So we agreed that we would do further research before we came to town meeting to make sure that we were asking for the right amount. And if we found that we may find that we need more than $5,000 for non-consultant costs and less than $30,000, which we're asking for consultant costs. Unfortunately, we can't change that language because it's outside the scope of the article. So if we find that's the case, we'll come back in the fall to ask for slightly changed language to enable us to have that flexibility. But the commission felt this was an appropriate amount and use of funds. And I'm going to turn it over to Gerry for a minute. And if he runs out of time, I hope you'll recognize him for another one.
Yeah, sure. I'll have to speak fast. Gerry Weiss, Precinct 8, Charter Commission. I think Andy actually covered a lot of the territory I was going to cover. Early on, the commissioners agreed to research what the costs of running a commission would be. We each contacted 2 to 3 towns and cities in the state and quizzed the chairs and various town clerks and came and found that various commissions spent between $4,500 and $60,000 on their charter commissions, and that the range for consultant fees was $0 to $40,000. So our figure of 35 is really close to the middle of the costs we found across the state. We don't know what our total printing, posting, mailing will be. We think it's going to be more than 5,000, and we may have to come back in the fall to repurpose some of this money. We couldn't divide it up for this article, as Andy explained, because it was not in the scope of the article to ask for anything but consulting money. We don't know exactly what our needs will be for consulting services. We're researching the possibilities of what different consultants can do, what we will exactly want them to do, and what we can get for free. For example, last week I began a conversation with the chief of the Technical Assistance Bureau of the Mass Department of Revenue, who is able to offer us free consultation on various parts of the charter process. We are very committed to a careful vetting of any outside consultant to assure their neutrality and their fit within the scope of our work. We're asking you to trust us with this money. Trust is taken a battering lately. Nothing up my sleeve. We will really do due diligence and spend the money wisely. As again, it was a unanimous vote by the whole commission, and it was only after we all agreed that we would do extensive research before deciding on how we would spend the money. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Brewer for the Select Board.
The Select Board on April 19th, as it says on your sheet, voted 5-0 to support this motion. I often don't volunteer to speak for town meeting articles, figuring I have more than enough to do organization-wise, but I volunteered to speak on this one because I wanted to make sure that we were clear on what we were voting on. What we're voting on is what they just talked about. We're not voting on a form of government here tonight. We are reflecting that the voters of this town said, have a charter commission. In order for that charter commission to do their work, they are going to need some consulting work, even though all of us kind of cringe at the idea of consulting. What I will say in favor of consulting, having it worked for us in many communities, is that Mr. Heckenbleckner, whose name has come up numerous times this evening, has also served in this capacity at another community, helping them with charter work. We had Kopelman and Page, our town council, many of you are familiar with that name, talk to the select board back in January, well before any vote was taken, about how charter commissions work and about the kind of work that Kopelman and Page can do, about the kind of work consultants can do, and they explained a great deal of the process to us. Many of you have been to the Charter Commission hearing, had been to the first Charter Commission meeting, have seen this handout associated with the hearing that was originally provided at town meeting and is still available online. So what this is about is making sure that there's a fully detailed process that explains why some proposal someday might better meet some needs than what we have now. And as they said, if they come up with different figures when they go out to consultants, then they can always change so that they have to account for all their money very effectively. You are not writing them a blank check in any way, shape, or fashion. This has to be covered very carefully by town procurement law.
Thank you. And Mr. Kubiak for the Finance Committee.
Moderator, the Charter Commission was strongly endorsed by the voters on March 29th at the town election. The Finance Committee believes the Commission should have the resources available to it that it needs to perform its duties under the statute and is mandated by the voters. So after meeting with the Charter Commission, the Finance Committee voted unanimously 7-0 to recommend this article to town meeting.
Thank you. Could we get the motion back on the screen, please? So the motion and the article are both before us. This requires a majority vote. Is there discussion before we come to a vote? I see a hand right in the front, second row.
Hi, Kenton Thar, Precinct 1. If this was not for consultants, I might be willing to vote for it. I think we need money more so to find out what the public feels about a charter commission and give input to what they need to do, that money could be better spent getting a town voice so that when the final vote did come, you might have a better chance of whatever that vote is passing or being defeated with more knowledge of what the town wants. Consultants, I'm afraid, I don't know, I don't know if they'll have their bias or if they won't have their bias. I'd be curious to know, I really don't know, but I'd be curious to know how many of the towns that had a charter commission were town meeting towns and what the outcome was, or how much they substantially changed their town government after having consultants and going through the process and how that ended up. So for now, I'll just vote against it. And in the fall, you can say you really need money for getting input from the town more than $5,000, and I think that'd be a great idea.
Yes, second row right here in the aisle.
Morianne Adams, Precinct 10. I think consultants is an unfortunate term here, and I do think that the Charter Commission was stuck with it before they really got going. As many of you know, I've been very engaged in this process, not on the same side as the majority of the Charter Commissions, but I have been attending their meetings, and I have been impressed thus far with their integrity and care. It does seem to me that there's a lot of expertise on that commission, and that will have to do with bringing in input, analyzing input, reaching out to the public. But there are also, I've been impressed to note, technical issues for which both legal support is needed and technical support is needed. Although I don't cheer to consultants, I'm a consultant myself, so I get pretty critical of the work of others. I've been very impressed with the work of Bernie Lynch and the consultant support that he offered to the select board to bring us excellent town meeting town managers. So I'm in the ironic position, given what you know of me politically, to support this request for consultants.
Thank you. And back corner there.
Vince O'Connor, Precinct 1. And so we've heard from the previous speaker about the $5,000 that has already been deposited in the Charter Commission's account. Let me talk to you about another $10,000 or so. And that's the $10,000 that is going to be needed at the end of the process, and which has been needed in the previous 2 charter commissions, to print the report of the commission and to have it mailed to every household in Amherst with a registered voter. So instead of looking at 30,000, we're looking at 45. And we've had 2 previous charter commissions. We have reams of material and advice and research from those 2 previous charter commissions. Neither Amherst nor Massachusetts has changed that much since the previous charter commission. And I personally believe so that because what's going to happen at the end of the process is that the commission is going to march into the town manager's office and say, here's our report.
Excuse me, you've been interrupted by a point of order, so we need to hear it.
Abby Jensen, Precinct 4. I don't believe the speaker is speaking to the motion before us. He's talking about possible funds that the town may or may not need to appropriate, and he also seems to be talking about somebody marching into somebody's office doing something that has nothing to do with this article that is now before us.
Okay. I'm going to allow the speaker to continue speaking. I wasn't crazy about the word marching either, but I let it go. But I do feel that what he's speaking about is in scope, and it's what we're all talking about here. So you may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. So the actual cost, if we vote for this article, is $45,000. We have lots of previous resources. We know that we are going to have to, as happened with the previous Charter Commission, we're going to have to print their report and mail it out to every registered voter. And if this article had was for doing all those things, I would vote for it. But it does not. This is not what it's for. It's $30,000 for a consultant. And so I can't vote for this article. I urge others not to. And I personally believe that if this were $20,000 for a consultant, I'd vote for it, knowing that we're going to have to pay out another $10,000 to print and mail the report. So again, please vote no, and I would urge somebody to reduce the amount so that we can have a realistic budget on our hands.
Mr. Weiss.
I'd like to respond to a few points. One is we knew about the cost of printing in the newspaper. That was part of the 35. I say 35 because we already have 5. 35 was a best guess. Like I said, it goes from 4,500 to 60,000. We are hoping, we could be wrong, that we'll be able to get some consulting services, not a consultant. We haven't even agreed on that. We might need some consulting services. And we could not ask money tonight for mailing. We could not ask for printing. We could not ask for soliciting from information from the community. It was outside the scope of the article, which is why I said if we find out by fall that we don't need all this for consulting, we will come back and ask to repurpose some of that money. We could be wrong. We could need more. I'm not promising that we don't need more. As far as input, I don't think we're going to need to spend much on getting input. We're doing everything we can to get input. We have a website up. Please use it. Please send in your comments. We had one public hearing. We're going to have another public hearing. We may send out surveys. That may cost a little money. It may not. I don't know yet. And as far as other towns, it ran the gamut. Towns to cities, changing their charter, towns remaining towns and keeping town meeting, cities updating their charter. They're all out there. We talk to everybody. I think I covered everything. Is there anything I left out?
Thank you. Yeah, in the orange shirt on the aisle there.
Janet McGowan, Precinct 8. I'm wondering if the Charter Commission has identified the problem it's trying to solve, because it's hard to analyze and have a consultant come in and look at changes when you haven't said what's wrong with the original or the functioning of government. And looking around here at all the boards and the town meeting members, I know we have a lot of citizen involvement in Amherst, so has the Charter Commission been talking about what the problems they're trying to solve as a threshold issue before they go forward, looking at different options?
Mr. Churchill.
The citizens asked us to look at our form of government and propose potential improvements. And so the way we've gone about collecting input is to ask people, what do you like about the way our government is organized to run our town? What do you think could be improved? What are the major challenges facing the town? And how do you think government could be organized to better meet those challenges? So we're leaving it fairly open-ended. The goal is to get the best sense of people across the town about what are the attributes, what are the values, what's the vision of where they think we could affect things more positively. And so in many cases, there are many people who voted for the Charter Commission who are talking about things that they love about current government, and there are people who voted to preserve the current form who are offering suggestions for change. So we have a sense that we need to be using the best processes for collecting input and getting a sense of the values that people hold, positive, affirmative values that we can then turn into design criteria. And then we want to compare those criteria. And once we have criteria, we can say, well, how do these various components of government meet our needs? And so we will continue to try to match those values of the community against the various options that exist for putting together, a model that best meets the values we hold. We know we want citizen involvement. There's also, interest in other aspects of a government that would, able to negotiate with the state or the university, or, there's going to be various number of attributes that come in. So I think our problem definition is basically to get a really good sense of what the town values about government, both the government it has and the government and the improvements it would like to see, and then see if we can map those onto any tweaks that the townspeople feel are an improvement over what we have. And if they don't feel that way, they'll vote it down. If they do feel that way, they'll vote affirmatively. So on the question of public outreach, that's really our job. We are not going to turn over the task of public outreach to a consultant, although we might ask them for tools that have been used elsewhere that have been effective in reaching different populations, or what's the benefit of qualitative versus quantitative measures or things like that. And similarly, we're not going to let them tell us what kind of government we want, but we would like to have them make sure that we're getting the full range of options for us to consider and see which ones map onto the values that we're finding in our outreach to the community. So hope that helps somewhat.
Thank you. Yes, second row from the back there.
Jim Oldham, Precinct 5. I'm inclined to support this, but I do have a question. So it seems to me that $35,000 is a reasonable target figure for the work that we want this commission to do. And if I'm understanding the presentation correctly, the hope is that perhaps less of this money than we would be appropriating tonight would be for consultants, and some of it could be repurposed in a different way. And I'm comfortable with that, and I'm largely comfortable voting that now. But the question is, it seems to me there are two ways to arrive at that outcome. One would be vote 30,000 now and have you come back in the fall, perhaps, if things turn out the way that you might be hoping and ask us to repurpose some of that money. What would be the downside of the second possibility, which would be appropriating, as a previous speaker suggested, perhaps say $20,000 for consultants, since the only thing that we can appropriate money for now is consultants, and allow you to come back in the fall and expect you to come back in the fall to ask for additional money, perhaps for consultants, perhaps for those mailings, perhaps for both, based on the greater knowledge. Is there a reason that that's not a reasonable strategy?
Mr. Churchill.
We talked about that in our meeting when we were talking about how would we know about, how would we establish the amount. And first of all, the way we came up with the figure in the first place was there were three separate sources that we looked at. We looked at how much was spent the last time around, the last charter effort, and that involved 2 elections, and so that, you know, but with inflation, it was just about, it was a little under $30,000, so it was $29,290 something dollars. I then asked East Longmeadow what their total budget was for consultants and for mailings and all the other costs, and they said $30,000, and they ended up giving $2,000 back at the end. And then I called the UMass Boston Collins Center, which does consulting, and did a presentation here for us at the League of Women Voters Candidates Night to explain the charter process, and said, what's an appropriate budget for a charter effort? And they said $30,000. So there's this convergence coming together around that figure. When I went to the select board, our temporary town manager suggested that there was a question about whether we have the $5,000 by statute, and then the question was, are we asking for 25 to make it a total of 30,000, or were we asking for an additional 30,000 to make it a total of 35? And he said that based on his experience and all of our experience in town, that we would probably find that 35,000 would be more appropriate given the amount of process that we like to have in this town. And so, so then we discussed in our commission meeting, well, should we ask for half of it up front and half of it later? And there were a couple of concerns about that. One is that we don't know if exactly what the size of a consultant scope would be, and if it turned out to be over 15,000 or whatever, 17, whatever, it's harder to contract for a part of the work rather than the whole scope of the work. And then secondly, we do feel like we have a pretty good sense that this is the overall budget for the project. We can, we can and we will plan to come back and ask you to expand the language, which was basically a mistake on my part for not saying commission services rather than consultant. So we're trying to do the best we can with the language we have. We will not, as Gerry said, we don't have anything up our sleeves. We're not looking to do a Cadillac version, but we don't know exactly what the contract would come out to, so I'd hate to say, well, we need $18,000 worth of consulting. We can do a contract for that, but we only have 15 now, and then we have to wait. So, we're asking that you would trust us that this is going to be the overall budget. We'll come back to you with language that would enable that flexibility between the mailing cost kind of stuff and the consultant kind of stuff, and we'll give you an update in the fall and ask for a language change if we need it, so that we balance those two sides out.
Thank you. Yeah, right there.
Michael Greenbaum, Precinct 6. I have no problem with the amount, and I'll support the motion. But I also want to support the questions that Ms. McGowan raised. And while I appreciate the outreach that the Commission has already done and plans to continue to do it, you will find, of course, that the town is of at least 2 minds, probably many more minds, on the matter of our governance. And the question is, how is the Commission going to deal with that, and at what point do you find a consultant to help you deal with that? I was elected to the first Charter Commission in 1994, and those records, incidentally, can't be found anywhere in town. I've tried the Select Board, the town clerk, and they suggested the North Amherst Library basement, but I haven't gone down there yet. But my big concern is that the commission not hire a consultant too soon and not without having some direct questions, not so much about process, but about the dilemmas that you might have in terms of substance. If the commission can try to find some areas of agreement, and I've been very impressed with the way the commission has started its work, then you can tell the commission, you can ask candidates, consultant candidates, how do we get to where we want to go? If the commission can not find areas of agreement, you can ask consultant candidates, how do we create a proposed charter in this condition? But I think it's important for the commission to do a little more work along these lines before you hire a consultant, and that your hiring process include ways of finding out consultants who can help you with what you want to do for the town of Amherst.
Yeah, third row right in the aisle there.
Yes, John Fox, Precinct 10. As many of you may know, I've objected many times to what's happened with consultants' money, feeling that we have not got our money's worth. I'm going to vote in favor of this Article 35 because I'm encouraged by a number of things. First, that Andy Churchill and Gerry Weiss can get up and embrace the same motion. It gives me some confidence that this is going to be a very transparent and a very careful process, and I think it will be. What I'd like to suggest as an aspect of the consultant's role to help you as you go along is that I'm very interested in data. I want you to have a lot of data before you and not just opinions. And one piece of it, which I think the consultant can help you with, is to really look back at the votes of town meeting over the last 3 to 5 years or so. Because I know town meeting is a central issue. The future of town meeting is a central issue for the commission. And really determine on any of the really substantive areas, the extent to which town meeting has supported the select board, finance committee, the planning board, and areas where there has been real disagreement and the sport hasn't followed. And I believe that if you do that process, you're going to find out that town meeting has been extremely supportive of the town in most areas. And the really divisive areas have become over-planning and recommendations of zoning. So I hope you go back and really determine, when have we supported you? When have we supported the town committees? And when has there been serious debate and objection? And what was that all about? And what were the merits of the argument against what was being proposed? So how do we arrive at that, to see whether town meeting has in fact been a responsible body in serving the community and in what ways? So I hope you really explore that, go back and get your data and present it to the town eventually. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and the blue shirt right there.
Marilyn Blaustein, Precinct 6. I call the previous question.
Motion for the previous question has been made and seconded. We will now come to an immediate vote. If 2/3 of you vote yes, we will end debate and come to a vote on the motion before us under Article 35. Everybody with me. We're now voting on the motion to end debate. Same thing as a motion for the previous question. All those in favor of the motion for the previous question, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Moderator hears 2/3. We now come to a vote on the motion before us. Under Article 35, this requires a majority vote. All those in favor of the motion under Article 35, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed, please say no. The ayes have it with the majority. Electronic vote has been requested. As soon as it's up on the screen, you may vote. And it's on the screen. Voting window is open. And we have 132 yes, 34 no, so the motion has passed.